Welcome to today's webinar. I am Jennifer Caddick. I'm the Vice President of Communications here at the Alliance for the Great Lakes. I'm joined here today in Chicago by Joel Bremmeyer, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO, Molly Flanagan, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President of Policy, and joining us from Cleveland, Ohio, we have Crystal Davis, Alliance for the Great Lakes Policy Director. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar titled Protecting the Great Lakes This Election Season. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. We are excited to have over 400 people registered and joining us today. To limit background noise, all participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. To ask a question, just use the question box as shown here at any time during the webinar. We'll leave plenty of time for your questions and try to get to as many of them as we can after we conclude our presentation. And now to get started, I will turn things over to Joel Bremmeyer, Alliance for the Great Lakes, President and CEO. Joel?
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the release of our 2018 Great Lakes Voter Toolkit. This is a new area of work for us, so I really appreciate everybody recognizing the importance, not just of policy debates or issue updates, but elections, which are incredibly important to the Great Lakes. Before we start today, I want to ask that you please keep in mind that the Alliance for the Great Lakes is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. That means that the content of our toolkit and this webinar are designed to provide you with information and questions you can use on a nonpartisan basis. Under no circumstances will the Alliance endorse specific candidates for office or offer advice on issues that could be construed as partisan. You won't even hear me refer to elected officials or candidates by name today for these reasons. But we're here today because the Great Lakes matter to elected officials. These officials listen to what you say. We know this because of the constant attention they show to our issues, such as federal environmental budgets, environmental regulation, invasive species prevention, and drinking water protection. We know this because protecting the Great Lakes means protecting the water that people like you depend on for their health and economic vitality. The good news is that there has often been sustained and bipartisan support from people like you and the elected officials that represent you for the Great Lakes. Historically, protection of the Great Lakes and clean water has not been a partisan issue, and our conversations around the region tell us that this remains true. But that does not mean that everybody agrees on the issues. We need true Great Lakes champions in office to keep our water clean and safe for all people, and to focus on solving big challenges in front of us rather than rolling back protections that we already have fought for. In this context, this is one of the most significant elections for the Great Lakes in years. The region will elect 7 governors and 8 senators in November. Some of those elections are wide open, meaning that we will see new faces in the region's leadership no matter what. The people that fill these seats are incredibly important in making decisions that affect the Great Lakes. For example, recent commitments to clean up Lake Erie, to support new protections against invasive species, and to fund key Great Lakes programs all required commitments from governors and members of Congress of both parties. Today, we will be reviewing a few Great Lakes issues we want you to talk about with candidates for elected office in your communities. We have chosen these issues for 2 simple reasons. 1, they are issues that we work on at the Alliance every day, and 2, we believe these are issues our elected officials have the power and the ability to make decisions on and to be accountable for over the next 2 years. Because of the nonpartisan nature of these basic clean water issues, you have a unique opportunity to demand that your candidates for elected office describe to you and your communities how they will be accountable for the protection and restoration of the Great Lakes. And we want to support you in doing this today and into November with the release of our Great Lakes Voter Toolkit. Now I'm going to turn it over to the Alliance's Vice President for Policy, Molly Flanagan, to walk us through issues and some of the questions that you may want to consider.
Thanks, Joel. Hi, everyone. This is Molly, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Right now, we have an opportunity to encourage candidates to stand up for the Great Lakes and to hold them accountable once they're elected. Now is the time for all of us to speak up about pressing Great Lakes issues. I'm going to go through the issues that we cover in the toolkit. For each issue, I'll discuss why it's important and what critical decisions are likely to be made about this issue in the next year or 2. You're going to notice that many of these decisions are going to be made by Congress or the states. In November, depending on where you live, you'll have the chance to vote on members of Congress, senators, and governors, along with a host of candidates for local office. These are the people who are going to make these decisions. While I'm talking about the issues and upcoming decisions, you will see example questions from the toolkit that you could ask candidates running for office to find out where they stand on these issues. You'll find even more questions in the toolkit, which you will receive after this webinar. And later in the webinar, we'll talk to you about ways you can use these questions. So let's talk about the issues. First, I want to start with aquatic invasive species. And if you get emails from the Alliance, you know we do a lot of work on Asian carp. Asian carp pose a serious threat to the Great Lakes. They eat food that other fish rely on for survival, and they fly out of the water, hitting boaters. It looks funny in videos, but they can seriously hurt people, which is bad for those of us who enjoy recreating on the Great Lakes. It's also bad for the economy of the Great Lakes if people stop visiting the lakes. Early next year, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers will release its plan for keeping Asian carp out of the Great Lakes. Congress and the Great Lakes states will need to provide money to build and maintain these protections. The state of Illinois has a particularly important role to play because the project to keep Asian carp out of the Great Lakes is going to be built in Illinois. And now I'm going to talk to you about ballast water, another aquatic invasive species issue. Aquatic invasive species such as zebra and quagga mussels have irreparably harmed the Great Lakes. They cause more than $200 million in damage annually to the region, and that tab gets picked up by communities around the lakes. Ballast water discharged by ocean-going ships entering the Great Lakes from other parts of the world is the single largest source of aquatic invasive species to the lakes. The Environmental Protection Agency is scheduled to release a new permit regulating ballast water later this year. Meanwhile, Congress is considering whether to revise ballast water protections that could leave the Great Lakes more vulnerable to new aquatic invasive species. And now I'm going to move to talking about water infrastructure and funding. And the first issue I want to talk about is drinking water. In 2017, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave our nation's drinking water system a D, saying that much of our drinking water infrastructure is nearing the end of its useful life. I think we can all agree that a D is unacceptable in nearly any circumstance, and certainly when we're talking about the state of our nation's drinking water. An estimated $1 trillion, that's trillion with a T, is necessary to repair, replace, and expand drinking water distribution systems over the next 25 years. And another $30 billion with a B is needed to replace every lead service line in the country. Right now, there isn't enough federal funding available for the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which pays for communities to improve outdated and failing drinking water infrastructure. Congress gets to decide how much money the fund receives, and states get to decide how this money is distributed to communities. Along with drinking water infrastructure, we also have issues in the Great Lakes region with sewage and stormwater runoff. More than 70% of all combined sewers, which collect both sewage and stormwater runoff in the United States, are located in the Great Lakes region. During heavy rains, these combined sewers overflow, releasing raw or poorly treated sewage directly into our rivers and lakes. That's gross. And it can shut down beaches in the summer or make rivers unsafe for boating. Over the next 25 years, the nation's wastewater and stormwater systems need at least $271 billion in investment. Similar to drinking water investments, right now, there isn't enough federal funding available for the Clean Water State Revolving Fund that helps communities pay for wastewater infrastructure improvements. Once again, Congress gets to decide how much money that fund receives, and states get to decide how that money is distributed to communities. Related to funding for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure are water affordability and safety. And I want to start with water affordability. While funding is critical for infrastructure improvements and repairs, it's also needed to protect consumers. Currently, there's a federal program called the Low Income Heat and Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, that provides aid to families that need help paying for heat and energy costs. Water and sewer bills on average are even higher than heat and energy bills, yet there is no federal program like LIHEAP for water. Congress could adopt a program like LIHEAP for water to ensure that low-income households don't lose access to water. We also need to keep our water safe. Water traveling to consumers through lead service lines pose a serious threat to the health and safety of residents around the region. Lead service lines need to be replaced in full, so that includes both the publicly and privately owned portions of the line. States can make sure that water utilities are able to use funds collected from ratepayers to replace lead service lines on private property. And Congress and the states can provide funds for lead service line replacement. Next, I want to talk about agricultural pollution. And if you joined our webinar last month about Lake Erie, you heard quite a bit about agricultural pollution. Runoff pollution from agricultural lands carries excessive nutrients into our waterways, which fuels harmful algal blooms across the Great Lakes region. This is a big problem in western Lake Erie, but also in Saginaw Bay and Green Bay and countless rivers and lakes across the Great Lakes region. These harmful algal blooms can turn toxic and threaten drinking water for communities. Congress can put Farm Bill dollars to work on the projects and practices that will do the most to reduce polluted agricultural runoff from reaching waterways across the nation and the Great Lakes region. And states can ensure that agricultural operators are held accountable for producing clean water at the same time that they're producing food and fuel. Finally, I want to talk about environmental protection and restoring the Great Lakes. Top of the list is the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which many of you are likely familiar with. The Great Lakes Restoration Initiative supports projects that address many of the issues we've discussed so far today. These projects clean up toxic pollution, restore fish and wildlife habitat, combat invasive species like Asian carp, and prevent polluted runoff from farms and cities from getting to the Great Lakes. Full federal funding of the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative at $300 million annually ensures that this work continues and that the Great Lakes continue to thrive. Congress gets to decide how much funding the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative receives each year. And finally, I want to talk a little about the Environmental Protection Agency. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency plays a critical role in safeguarding our Great Lakes from pollution and protecting human health. In the Great Lakes region, we have an EPA office based in Chicago. It helps to distribute Great Lakes Restoration Initiative dollars, and it works with state regulators to protect our air, land, and water. Congress gets to decide how much funding the EPA receives, and it provides direction to EPA about how to use those funds. As you can see, decision makers at the state and federal levels have important roles to play in protecting the Great Lakes and public health. Now is the time to talk to candidates about these pressing Great Lakes issues and ask them questions so you can understand their views and where they stand on the Great Lakes. And now I'm happy to hand things over to Crystal Davis, the Alliance's Policy Director based out of Ohio. She's going to talk to you about the tools in the toolkit and how you can put them to use.
Great. Thanks, Molly. Good afternoon again. I am Crystal Davis, and I'm based here in Ohio. And now that you're up to speed on Great Lakes issues and equipped with some great questions to ask candidates, let's dig into ways to start using the toolkit and allow your voice to be heard during this busy election season. First and foremost, please make sure you are actually registered to vote. You can verify your registration and check the registration deadline for your area at the local Board of Elections website. You should also be able to verify your polling place and get information about the offices and candidates. Some of that information can also be found on your state's Secretary of State website as well. As you gear up for the elections this season and start the process of learning more about your prospective representatives, it's vital that you work to inform candidates of your priority issues and perspectives on policy matters, especially concerning the Great Lakes. Feel free to use whatever advocacy strategy works best for you and your schedule, your time. But the most important thing is that your voice is being heard. As previously mentioned, our toolkit outlines several ways to get involved this election season. And plenty of helpful tips as well on ways to amplify your voice. Personally, I am most excited about the sample questions, which are particularly helpful when talking one-on-one with candidates or speaking up at a candidate's forum, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. The questions are also a great starting point for researching water issues. So even if you have children that aren't able to vote yet, this is a great starting point for them to start researching these Great Lakes issues and how they affect their everyday lives. We love to hear about how you're getting active this election season, what you're hearing on water issues, and how you were able to use the toolkit. And so to download the toolkit or to write us about your efforts, visit us online at greatlakes.org/2018 midterms. One of the many ways to get engaged and educated for the upcoming election is to attend candidates forums or voter forums. A candidate forum is a public event where candidates running for office are invited to express their positions on various issues. These events are held by civic organizations, churches, universities, and community groups. When you attend these events, please take the opportunity to ask a question. Asking candidates where they stand on Great Lakes issues raises awareness and allows constituents to hold them accountable once elected. This is your chance to hear from candidates in real time on their perspectives on water issues. And whether your priority Great Lakes issue is toxic algae, invasive species, or even water affordability, knowing a candidate's views on a policy will be helpful and informative. If you get a chance to go out and ask a candidate about a Great Lakes issue you care about, we love to hear about that experience at greatlakes.org/2018 midterms, so we can learn more about how you help to protect the Great Lakes this season. You also have the option of writing a letter to the editor of your local newspaper. Letters to the editor are short responses to articles that recently appeared in local publications. This is one of the most read sections of the newspaper. You could also write an opinion editorial, which is a short article expressing your viewpoint on a timely news topic. Many candidates and their staff also keep tabs on these opinion pages as they indicate the interest of their prospective constituents. This can be a very powerful platform for getting your message out. It helps to generate more attention for and discussion about Great Lakes issues. Whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, or other platforms, using social media leading up to the election can be a great way to engage with candidates in a more informal way. Following news outlets and candidates on social media can also help to educate you about their platforms and keep you up to date on the candidates' events and views. So join virtual Great Lakes debates and discussions. Tag relevant accounts in your posts and use hashtags to add and stay clued in on conversations. We even have some sample hashtags in the toolkit. And as a final step, don't forget to vote. Get out the vote for the Great Lakes. Bring your friends, your family, and your neighbors too. This is the most important part of the process. Again, no matter how you choose to raise your voice for the Great Lakes, we want to hear about your experience. So we'll be asking you to report back so you can share your stories with our policy staff to inform our post-election follow-up work. And the website is again on the screen. And I will send it back over to Joel.
Thank you, Crystal. In just a moment, we're going to be turning it over to you for any questions that you would like to ask. So please get those ready now, and I'll ask Jen Caddick to walk us through how that's going to go in just a minute. But before we do that, I just want to, again, thank you all for joining us today and for your attention to the reality that elections matter and elections matter for the Great Lakes. We spend a lot of time at the Alliance talking about the issues we care about, but we only get a chance as residents of the Great Lakes to make this choice every so often. And it's important that you do as best you can to take the actions that Crystal just laid out to help get the word out. And we really appreciate the time you spend on that. We know you've got a lot of opportunities or needs that you're trying to address in your daily lives, and any chance you have to speak up on the Great Lakes with candidates is much appreciated. After this webinar, you're going to receive a copy of the voter toolkit, and you can also go to our website at greatlakes.org to download that toolkit. And I want to repeat what Crystal said at the end of her comments. We really would appreciate it if you'd report back on what you hear when you speak to candidates for office, when you ask them some of these questions or questions that you come up with on your own based on Great Lakes issues. We'd like to hear what they say, and we'd like to keep track of that information so we understand what candidates are saying about the Great Lakes, and we understand the commitments that are being made to protect and restore the Great Lakes in the future. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Jen Caddick for our Q&A.
Thank you, Joel, Molly, and Crystal, for that very informative and helpful briefing on how we can all get involved in raising awareness about Great Lakes issues during this important election season. As while you are all taking a minute to figure out how to type in questions, here's on the screen shows you where to type those in. It'll be the question box. As you all are thinking about and writing in your questions, I'm going to start off with a couple just to get us going. Crystal, one question there, one piece that I think would be great for you to dig a little bit into is, as we've developed this toolkit here on staff, we came up with all of those great sample questions that Molly shared with us. And one thing we've talked about here on staff is how it's important for voters, as they're asking questions at a candidate forum or writing a letter to an editor, about personalizing those questions to your experience or your concerns. Could you tell us a little bit more about why that's important and how somebody might do that?
Sure. It's incredibly important that we do personalize those stories and those questions. And so feel free to get creative with our questions too and use them, as a template, but definitely add your own personal story to those. As a former staffer in the Ohio House, it was incredibly important to kind of hear how people were feeling, why they were feeling that way, and be able to rely on those stories for some rationale for how to vote for various policies that were presented to us in the legislature. And so during this time, it's important that not only the candidates, but their staff understands why their prospective constituents are feeling a certain way. Hearing their personal stories are definitely more compelling than just saying, hey, I want you to vote for this. It helps to make the case for why they should prioritize certain issues.
That's helpful. Thank you, Crystal. We have a question here asking which 28 midterm race is most important for the Great Lakes, whether it's a Senate seat or a governor or House race. Joel, do you want to address that question?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And I think the answer is that wherever you live, to be honest, whatever state you live in, whatever congressional district you live in, you can likely find a critical Great Lakes issue that is going to matter to the gubernatorial or Senate or congressional candidates or even local candidates. There's no shortage of critical issues that are playing out in the Great Lakes states right now. From questions about agricultural pollution in Ohio to questions about how Great Lakes water is being used in multiple states, to questions about invasive species that affect multiple states. To be honest, there's anybody who lives in a Great Lakes state can find in at least one of the issues in the toolkit, if not more, an opportunity to weigh in with elected officials in your state or in your congressional district that matters a great deal for the Great Lakes. So that's I'd encourage anybody who's thinking about this, who if you don't see the issue in your state that you think is critical for the Great Lakes, reach out to us and we'll help you figure that out if it's not part of our toolkit.
Thanks, Joel. I have a couple of questions asking about whether or not the toolkit provides a template letter to the editor or template information to ask candidates. And as Joel and Crystal and Molly mentioned, you'll be receiving a link to the toolkit shortly after the webinar. We do not provide templates for like letters or things like that, but what we do include in there is essentially a summary of the briefing that Molly just gave you. So a little bit of information about each issue and some potential questions that you can modify or adapt to your purposes. So there's a lot of that information in the toolkit that we're excited to share with you this afternoon. So here's a great question, and maybe I'll pass this over to Molly, which is always an interesting one when we work with elected officials. When we ask questions at candidate forums, what is a good strategy to use to ensure that candidates are sincere or really sharing their direct opinion? And I think this is a concern that a lot of people have these days.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to something that Crystal said about, personalizing your questions, making it clear why the issue is important to you, and then to the degree that you're able, pushing candidates to give specific answers. It's easy to say, I love the Great Lakes. It's harder to talk about what your specific platform is for keeping agricultural pollution out of Lake Erie or out of, Lake Huron. And so I think, to the degree that you are able to ask specific questions, that helps to get more specific answers. And then I think the thing that we at the Alliance and everyone can play a role in is after candidates are elected to office and they've made these commitments, tracking what they're actually doing. Like, what did they say they're going to do, and now what are they doing? We have a chance to hold those elected officials accountable. And so to the degree that you can get folks on the record making specific commitments related to the Great Lakes, we can do follow-up once they're in office to make sure they're living up to those commitments.
Thanks, Molly. We have a question asking from someone noting that they have had good success in connecting directly with candidates, either by email or other methods, with specific concerns, questions, or issues that they care about, and asking if that's a method that we include in the toolkit or not. Joel, would you want to?
Sure, I'm happy to. And this is a great example of adapting the information that's in the toolkit to your own methods that you know are effective. We focus in the toolkit a lot on tools or methods for outreach that can be used in public forums like social media, for example, or voter forums that are attended by voters and the press. But certainly direct email, if you've got a candidate or a campaign that is responsive to you by direct communication, by all means, that should be a way of communicating. We do encourage everybody who uses that method to reach out to all of the campaigns that are running for a particular seat to make sure you're getting that information in front of everybody. So those candidates, regardless of which party they're running for, understand that that's a concern in the district. So yes, please do email as much as you want.
Thanks, Joel. Molly, I'm going to give this next question to you. We have someone who's written asking about some legislation called WOTUS, which is the Waters of the U.S. rule, and the controversy around that, and asking what the Alliance's perspective is on that rule and whether that is something that voters should be talking to candidates about.
Yeah, absolutely. So the list of issues that we included in our toolkit is definitely not a comprehensive list of issues impacting the Great Lakes. And the Clean Water Act is very clearly a bedrock protection for Great Lakes and waters across the United States. And the Waters of the U.S., or Clean Water Rule, you may have heard it by a number of different names, certainly is under attack from a lot of different fronts, and making sure that rivers, lakes, wetlands across the country are protected is critical to making sure drinking water and recreational opportunities across the country are protected. And this is 100% true in the Great Lakes as well. And so, you know, when you have opportunities to interact with candidates or to write about issues that you care about, definitely, you know, upholding bedrock environmental laws like the Clean Water Act is something we would 100% encourage you to do with candidates running for office.
Thanks, Molly. I'm going to give this question to Joel, which I think is one that we often hear from people concerned about Great Lakes issues and supporters, and it's something that some other organizations do, both environmental groups and not. And the question is asking whether or not we would publish a scorecard on elected officials or candidates. Joel?
The Alliance, and I mentioned this at the top of our call today, the Alliance for the Great Lakes is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. So that's a federal tax designation. What that means is that the Alliance doesn't actually take positions on particular candidates or provide information that even may be construed as partisan for or against particular candidates. So the Alliance does not provide scorecards for candidates.
Great. Thank you, Joel. I have another question for Molly. And the question is asking, does the Alliance for the Great Lakes work directly with Congress, or do we work more as an influencer for voters?
Yeah, so we do both. The Alliance for the Great Lakes definitely works directly with members of Congress on Great Lakes issues. We do that in a bipartisan fashion. So we work with Republicans and Democrats and basically anyone in office who cares about the Great Lakes. And we also work to educate those who maybe don't care as much about the Great Lakes to get them to care about the Great Lakes. So we do a lot of direct engagement of members of Congress. We also do a lot of work with our supporters. So people like you on this phone call, people who've signed up to be on our email list, to make sure that they're aware when there are opportunities to influence members of Congress on a particular Great Lakes issue. And that's really important because, you know, I can do the work that I do, Crystal can do the work that she does with members of Congress, talking to those offices about Great Lakes issues, but they also really want to know what their constituents think. And so when we send out emails asking you guys to contact members of Congress about some of the issues that we've talked about today or other issues we haven't talked about today, it's really important for you to take those actions because they listen to us differently when they've heard from a bunch of their own constituents that an issue is important. So 100%. We do that work with Congress, and we rely on you to do that work with Congress better.
Thanks, Molly. We have a question here asking if the Alliance will be hosting any of our own candidate forums. Joel, do you want to tackle that question?
I'm happy to. We are actually not hosting any candidate forums just by the Alliance, and this is why we encourage you. This is different in every community. Candidate forums are often are based on issues that are a big draw within congressional districts or within states, and one single issue like the Great Lakes may not be enough to get a candidate forum out, but that's going to vary from place to place depending on where you are. And so I would encourage you to be looking for opportunities that are relevant to your particular district that you're in, which is going to be the basis for candidate forums that are being hosted there. We at the Alliance, we have done some direct education of candidates ourselves. So part of what we do at the Alliance is to reach out to campaigns on a nonpartisan basis and provide them with information of the type that you're seeing in the voter, or you'll see in the voter toolkit, to educate them on our priority issues on a nonpartisan basis. And so we do that directly.
Thanks, Joel. My next question I'm going to send over to you, Crystal. And this is about one of the tips that we suggested regarding letters to the editor. And the question asker notes that sometimes it's very hard to get your letter published in a really large newspaper such as the Chicago Tribune or, those really big newspapers that receive a lot of submissions. And so the question is asking if it would be better to write a letter to a suburban or perhaps an alternative weekly newspaper and not those big publications. Would you be able to address that question, Crystal?
Sure. I think it's best to write both. I don't think it has to be a situation where you have to choose one publication over another. If you want to write to the large newspaper, but then also to your local newspaper or to your local CDC that puts out a newsletter to residents in the area, and that your local candidates will see it. Those type of things are important as well. And whatever scale you use, the most important thing is that you're getting your voice out. And so I think it's best to write at any of them, the large publications all the way down to some of the smaller newsletters and magazines in your area as well.
Thanks, Crystal. I would add to that, you can kind of combine your tactics, connecting with your local news outlets and social media, because I've seen where sometimes a news outlet will be hosting a candidate forum or a debate, and a lot of times they will ask their readers what types of questions they should ask. And so those are other ways, in addition to writing letters to the editor, to connect with your local news sources and encourage them to ask questions about the issues that you care about, and in this case, the Great Lakes. Crystal, one thing I would like to go back to, and you did a great summary at the beginning, and I'm wondering if you could repeat for folks today how to find out how to register to vote. Certainly that's one of the most important messages from us today, in addition to all of the Great Lakes information we've provided. And you shared some great resources on registering to vote and where to find out how to, if you are registered or not. Could you reshare that information, Crystal?
Sure. Your local county board of elections website is a good place to start, or actually going to the Board of Elections if you don't have access to a computer. But going there to register to vote is a way to do it. There's also information on your state Secretary of State website. I actually visited Ohio Secretary of State website yesterday just to look and see what kind of information is there. I understand for some first-time voters, the process can be very intimidating. And going to the website, it not only tells you how to register, what those deadlines are, but also what type of ID you need to bring with you, where your polling place is. It's better to confirm all of that information up front. There are also states where you may have registered a very, very long time ago. It's probably a good idea for you to make sure that you are still registered and just verify your registration. So again, your county board of elections site or the state Secretary of State's website. And there are a number of groups that are probably going around your community and your city right now that are doing voter registration drives that could also help you as well.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Crystal. We have a question asking about, specifically in Wisconsin, there has been a lot of debate and discussion around water diversions, and asking if there's anything in the toolkit on that issue. And we did not specifically include that in the toolkit, but Molly, I don't know if you want to address that, or Joel.
Yeah, so I think this is an area where, obviously there are significant issues related to the Great Lakes and local waterways in places all across the region. And I know that water diversion issues are definitely a hot topic, particularly in southeast Wisconsin, and that bleeds over into Illinois. And so that's something that is top of mind for a lot of people living in those areas, and probably, or it could be top of mind for candidates running in those areas. And so this is where I think it's important, as you're looking at the toolkit and the sample questions that we have for some of the issues that we discuss, you can use those to think about how you might phrase questions about issues that are personal to you, that are particularly important to you related to the Great Lakes and where you live.
Got it. Thanks, Molly. I have a question here asking if someone were to write a letter to the editor or an op-ed, if the Alliance staff would be able to vet those. Unfortunately, we just don't have capacity to do all of that. And, as Molly just mentioned, what's most powerful, and Crystal has touched on this as well, is writing about issues in your own voice and from your own perspective. We know that newspapers care about your perspective, as do candidates. And so I don't know if you want to talk any more about that, Molly.
Yeah, I think, and I can't stress this enough, candidates for office are, and really their staff and them, are very, very carefully tracking what conversations are happening on social media, in local newspapers. They're very much tuned to what people are talking about because they know that people are making decisions about who to vote for based on issues that are getting, talked about in their districts. And so what I would say is the most important thing that you can do is to make sure that whatever the Great Lakes issue is, that it's getting attention where you live, whether that's attention at a candidate forum, attention on your local news or in the local newspaper, attention on social media, even just conversations that you're having with your friends, family, neighbors, community about these issues. The more that you can get Great Lakes issues bubbling up as an issue of importance where you live, the more likely it is that candidates running for office where you live are going to feel like that's an issue that they have to talk about, that they have to take a position on, and that then they have to do something about. And so the more that all of us can do to make sure Great Lakes are part of the conversation this election season, the more likely we are to see good results for the Great Lakes come January.
Thanks, Molly. Crystal, do you want to add in anything on that?
Sure. I think the other thing to mention is that we have a great communication staff at the Alliance, but them editing or even drafting the op-ed doesn't mean that there's any higher of a likelihood of it actually being published. And like Molly said, what gives you a higher likelihood of being published is a personal story that really pulls on heartstrings and really gives the rationale behind why your Great Lakes issue should be a priority. I think one thing to mention is that don't ever be intimidated if you don't know the technical jargon or the science behind everything in the issue that you're trying to communicate about. It's not about that. You speak from your point of understanding and communicate that and seek guidance on, or not actually seeking guidance, but seek information on the candidate's perspective on that issue from your point of understanding. And actually what you'll find is that a lot of the candidates probably have the same base of knowledge that we do on these issues, that everyday citizens do. And so I think just speaking your own voice, be confident about your questions. And I think that not only will the candidates appreciate hearing from you and what's important to you, but then we'll also be enlightened on their perspectives, which will help us when it's time to cast our votes.
Thanks, Crystal. That is great perspective. With that, I think we're going to wrap it up. We greatly appreciate all of your questions, and I'll hand it over to Joel for some last words.
Thanks, Jen. And on the heels of what we were just talking about, just by being part of this webinar today, you have joined that public conversation about what it means to be a Great Lakes champion when you're an elected official. And I really appreciate you making the time today to be part of that. And to echo what was just said by Molly and Crystal, to really focus on making that conversation continue in your community. It's not about having the exact words or about taking the exact right position as much as it is about showing that the Great Lakes matter to the people who live near you, to your friends, to your family, because your candidates for office are paying attention. And the more you can do to keep that conversation going, the more likely we'll have Great Lakes policies and programs in the coming years that are going to be positioned to protect the environment, to protect the health of people, and to protect the clean water that we all care about so deeply. Thanks so much for being with us today. Look forward to getting the toolkit in your email box, and we'll look forward to hearing from you about what you've been able to do to get the word out. Thanks, everybody.
Great. Thanks, Joel. Have a nice day, everybody.